chapter 1. This is going to coincide with a lot of things in our lab manual. So as an overview of topics, I've tried to organize the PowerPoint by what's going to come up in lecture versus what's going to come up in lab. So I tend to put lecture with purple, and you might see the word lecture in purple on a slide. That means that that's important to lecture. And if it's red with lab, then that's important to lab. So we're going to do a brief introduction to anatomy and physiology. And then we're going to, this won't be the last time we talk about it, but we're going to be talking about the levels of organization. And you'll notice that there's no corresponding lab component for that. However, a lot of this is going to overlap in lab versus lecture. So it'll occur in both. And then lastly, this little bit, we really just focus on lab, the abdominal pelvic quadrants and regions, although I will introduce them here. So anatomy and physiology, you want to be able to define these. Anatomy is the study of structure and form. Physiology is the study of function and body parts. So structure and form will come up with things that you can label, that you can point out. So an example with this muscle fiber, and we'll be getting to this in chapter 10 and lab 9, will be like, hey, this is a myofibril right here. That is structure. Here's the nucleus of the cell. Striations. Those are things that you can label, talking about anatomical parts. The physiology would be like the contraction. So we're going to talk all about the physiology in chapter 10 for muscles. These are just examples though. With the uterus, things that are examples, the uterus itself as an organ, that's something anatomical. All of the different parts of the uterus. There's the fundus, there's the cervix, there's the different layers, the endometrium. That's all anatomical, and then kind of how it relates to pregnancy, reproductive system, all of that would be the physiology. So is it more structure, that's anatomy, or is it more function? That's physiology. And on Blackboard, you should have access to some Kahoots to kind of reinforce those topics. Here's just a couple other examples that you can read through. So this is probably the largest thing here to remember. If you can label it, it's likely to be anatomy. And then if you're describing the function, it's physiology. So structure of muscle fibers, skeletal muscle cells versus muscle contraction. Structure of the uterus versus pregnancy. Lung structure, alveoli, surfactant production versus breathing and respiration. Chambers of the heart, the valve structure, the cardiac muscle type, that's coming in 169, versus actually pumping the blood and getting the heart beating and things like that. So anatomy, we just defined, was structure. There's lots of ways to go about organizing it. And there's a couple of things that we want to define as far as different terminology. So cytology is the study of cells. This top picture on the left here is just of a neuron that I grabbed off the internet. We will be looking into the basics of the cell in lab. We will be looking at different microanatomies of the cell. And so this falls under microscopic. And then there's histology with the tissues. So these pictures here are actually from my graduate school work. So I was at Duke and I worked with mice and I injected them with LPS and then looked at what happened to their thymus tissue in response to that. So this bottom left picture is a hematoxylin and eosin staining of a mouse thymus. You can see thymus has little nodules in it. There's a cortex and a medulla. So I'm going to put C for cortex, M for medulla. The word cortex and medulla is going to come up over and over and over again in 168 and 169. Cortex just means outer, and medulla means the inner portion of something. So the nodule cortex versus the nodule medulla. We'll be talking about the medullary cavity in the bone, which is the very innermost part of the bone. So remember cortex and medulla, make note of that. This other picture here is again of a mouse thymus. Instead of being a standard hematoxylin and eosin stain, it's stained with immunofluorescent antibodies so that you can look under a fluorescent microscope. All of these little blue dots, it's very low mag, but these are all developing thymocytes. And then I was actually staining for thymus epithelium with these red and green sections. So just some different pictures letting you know that I feel your pain when you're going through chapter 5 and all of the histology with the lab, because I have spent many hours of my life looking at slides and looking under the microscope and stuff. The right half of this slide, so everything else is going to fall under gross anatomy or a large anatomy, so really tiny versus big. There's different ways your book goes over in the Chapter 1, start, regional, surface, comparative, embryology. These are different ways that you can organize it. But our book takes a systemic approach. So we'll be looking at organ systems kind of per chapter once we get through the first few chapters. That will kind of build our toolbox for things that we'll need to discuss as we go through the rest of the book. Levels of organization, it will be really important for you to be able to put this in order. One of the ways that I test it is I might ask you to put it in order. I might give you options where there's only one correct order. I might give you where there's not all of the different levels, but you still have to put them in order even though some of them are missing. So take a moment right now and just look at this and practice. The smallest level of organization is the atom. Now, in chapter 2, we're going to look at the subatomic particles, but as far as a level, the atom is the smallest that we're going to deal with. The example here would be oxygen. So anything on the periodic table of the elements are groups of similar atoms, is going to be the smallest level that we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about carbon, nitrogen, sodium, chlorine, all of those are atoms, anything that you find on that periodic table. Atoms will come together to form molecules. Water is a very important inorganic molecule that we're going to talk about. It's not organic because it doesn't have carbon. You have to have carbon to be an organic molecule. Water is a polar molecule, which is going to set up a lot of the interactions that we have in the body. But molecules are groups of atoms that have been bonded together. So they're connected. We're going to study covalent bonds. We're going to study ionic bonds. But these are things that are holding a molecule together. So these have been covalently bonded. Oxygen to hydrogen is actually a polar covalent bond, and we'll look at that in chapter 2. Molecules will come together to form macromolecules. In chapter 2, we're going to look at the 4 classes of macromolecules: lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. The DNA and RNA in your cells is an example of the macromolecule that is the nucleic acid. The next level of organization that we have is the organelles. We're going to study this in chapter 4, and we're going to study it in lab 2 when we look at kind of the basic cell biology. We'll learn about all of the organelles. Mitochondria is an important organelle, and we'll actually talk about the function of the mitochondria in cellular respiration with chapter 3. Organelles are the little organs of cells. Cells are the next level. Here we're going to be looking at many different cell types throughout the semester. An example right here is blood cells. There's 2 different types, red blood cells, white blood cells. Red blood cells have been enucleated, so they've lost their nucleus, which gives you that kind of donut shape that allows them to travel through the capillaries. Groups of cells are going to come together in what we call tissues. Chapter 5 will look at tissues. We're going to look at epithelium, connective tissue, which by example on here, areolar connective tissue, which is a subtype of connective tissue. And there's also muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Different tissues will come together to make organs. So organs is what you're studying in Lab 1. We're going to name a lot of those organs on that torso model and link it to that organ system. So systems is how our book is set up. We're going to look at the integumentary system. We're going to look at the digestive system. You're going to look at the urinary system. You're going to look at the nervous system. So we're going to go through systems. All of those systems function together to create the highest level of organization, which is the organism, which is us. What do I expect you to get out of this? 1, we're going to use these levels throughout the semester, and even 169, when we learn new terminology, we're going to automatically go back and apply it to these levels of organization so that we know exactly what we're talking about. 2, when it comes up on the exam, you'll want to be able to rank these in the correct order. And I'm going to do that with the multiple choice question, but I'm not necessarily going to give you all of them. So you'll have to be able to apply and fill in the blanks. You'll really want to know it, not just memorize that list. All right, anatomical position or anatomic position we use this for consistency. All of the directional terms that we'll be using we will use in reference to the anatomical position. So eyes are forward, head is level, you're standing upright, you're not lying down. Your arms are at your side, they're down towards your side, they're just resting, they're not touching your body, they're not extended out at your shoulder, they're not above your head. Your feet are parallel and flat on the floor. Your legs are, we're just going to say shoulder width apart or about shoulder width apart, right? Your feet aren't touching, nor are they kind of spread out. Anatomical right and left. This goes by the patient or client. Your right arm is your right arm. So when you go to the doctor and you say, hi, I got this lump on my right arm, they're going to look at your right arm. That is anatomical right, even though it will be on their left side. You want to use anatomical left and right in the lab when we name things on the lab practical, and you want to be aware of it going forward. Anywhere that is appropriate, you're going to be expected to designate that anatomical left and right. Body planes and sections. There's many different planes or sections that you're going to be expected to know. Where are you going to come across this? Well, when we look at diagrams that are going through the human body, you'll want to know what orientation that you're looking at. If there's medical scans that people are looking at, you want to know what section it is going through. You'll also want to know, maybe not you personally, but we use it upon biopsies, autopsies, sectioning through organs and things to know what orientation everything is set up in. The coronal plane, also known the frontal plane, this is dissecting a body into an anterior and posterior portion. You can be in that frontal plane anywhere along. You don't have to cut neatly exactly as this body is. If you were moving that blue line a little bit forward, as long as you're going from the top of your head, slicing down on the side of the body like that, you're going to be in that frontal plane. Transverse, sometimes this is known as cross-section, is anything that is going and separating things from a superior to an inferior. Mid-sagittal and sagittal are related. Mid-sagittal cuts things in an equal half. If you are slightly off center, you are now sagittal. So anything in that plane but not exactly equal half, instead of being mid-sagittal, is just sagittal. If you're at an angle at all, we call that oblique. You might have just heard me use some of those directional terms. Anterior is towards the front of the body, posterior is towards the back. Superior is the upper portion, inferior is a lower portion. Medial is whatever is closest to the midline of the body. So you see that midline drawn there, kind of that mid-sagittal plane that we were just looking at. If you're closer to that midline, you refer to that as medial. We'll use this in the bones and the joints. For example, we have menisci in our knees. So we'll say, oh, the medial meniscus. That means the meniscus that is closest to the midline of the body. We'll also use lateral. Lateral means that's closer to the outside of the body. It's kind of the opposite of medial. We'll use that. There's a lateral meniscus. We'll talk about medial ligaments, lateral ligaments. Proximal and distal, you'll see the arrows are going in the same direction as superior and inferior, respectively. But this is referring to the appendages, and it's technically what is closest to the insertion point of the trunk. So your arm, your shoulder is proximal, and your hand is distal. We'll see this with the bones. When we get to the phalanges, we'll name some of them. We'll say, oh, those are distal phalanges or proximal phalanges. There's some in the middle that we call middle phalanges. So we'll use that a lot with the appendages. Here's the definition, a lot of those terms that we use, and there's a couple more that you might come across. Dorsal and ventral are very similar to anterior and posterior. So in front of versus at the belly side for anterior versus ventral. Dorsal is the back side of the human body. Posterior is just back of. Cranial or cephalic means towards the head. Caudal and rostral we won't use as much. If you're a veterinarian or work with animals, you might hear that a little bit more, because as you go to walking on all fours, you now have different areas. Anterior is now going to be different than ventral, and you might refer to the caudal and the rostral with different types of animals. I mean, you could use it for humans, but we don't tend to see that as much as the other terms. Deep and superficial, we'll get to that with the integument. We're going to study 5 layers of the epidermis. So superficial is the top layer of skin, and then you're going to continue down deep. Refer to something as axial, we're talking about the head and the torso. When we talk about appendicular, you're talking about the arms and the legs. This figure here in your book, I call this Naked Man. You're going to have a Naked Man poster in lab that I'm going to label for lab practical. There's a list in your lab manual and the lab material that tells you which ones of these you need to know. You need to know most. All right, so this section is about body cavities and serous membranes. You want to know this for both lecture and lab. Body cavities are enclosed spaces. There's 2 main body cavities, the ventral cavity and the posterior aspect. I'm going to talk about the posterior aspect first. There's 2 subcavities to this, the cranial cavity. The cavity is the enclosed space. The brain sits in the cranial cavity. The vertebral canal, the spinal cord sits in that enclosed space. What is special about this is that these cavities are completely encased in bone. The brain and spinal cord are part of the central nervous system. Very important. We want to protect them, so they're encased in bone. This also happens to be, like the name says, posterior aspect, more posteriorly located. The ventral cavity, not encased in bone, but it is lined with serous membranes. Serous membranes are a body membrane. There's 4 types of body membranes. We'll learn about that in chapter 5. A body membrane, by definition, is epithelium and underlying connective tissue. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The ventral cavity is anteriorly located, and I have thoracic and abdominal. I really should have thoracic cavity and then abdominal pelvic cavity. So that is the ventral cavity. Thoracic cavity is superior to the diaphragm. I'm going to put T for thoracic. The abdominal pelvic cavity, which I'm drawing in green, the abdominal pelvic cavity is inferior to the diaphragm. The pelvic cavity, there's nothing really anatomical like the diaphragm that is demarcating the pelvic cavity. We talk about it being so that the pelvic area, when we get to the pelvis and we get to the bones, you'll see the os coxa, and that kind of defines where the pelvic cavity is. So the pelvic cavity is a subcavity of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and above that you're going to have just the abdominal cavity. Okay, so this slide is about the thoracic cavity. In your lab manual, you'll notice that we don't have these subcavities of the thoracic cavity listed, but you want to know them for lecture, and I make them extra credit for lab. The thoracic cavity here I'm highlighting in red. The thoracic cavity is part of the ventral cavity, and it is this entire region. This bilateral cavity here contains the lungs, in purple. Mediastinum. The mediastinum contains the heart, thymus, esophagus, trachea, and blood vessels, especially the aorta coming off the heart. The mediastinum, I'm highlighting in yellow here. This contains the heart. So the heart sits in the pericardial cavity, but the mediastinum is this entire area here. Now your book shows this because they have this kind of line, they draw it like this. They're like, here's the mediastinum. So be aware that it is that entire area. Then inside the mediastinum, you have the heart with the pericardial cavity. So I said ventral cavities are lined by serous membranes. Serous membranes, it's a body membrane, so we're going to have epithelium and underlying connective tissue. So that epithelium and underlying connective tissue is going to be both in, so I'm going to put epithelium connective tissue. That is a tissue layer. There's going to be 2 of those. If you look at this picture here with this balloon, what they're trying to show you is that these visceral and parietal layers are kind of connected. The organ actually, when it develops, it starts to invaginate into these cavities. So you have this epithelium connective tissue layer. If you were going to insert your hand into a balloon, if you closed your fist, let's say that's the heart because there's a serous membrane around the heart, and you inserted it into the balloon, the latex that touches your hand becomes the visceral layer. The visceral layer actually touches the organ tissue. So touching the myocardium is the visceral layer. Then the latex that's on the outside of the balloon, that now we call the parietal layer. Then the air that's in between the latex of the balloon is our example of where you're going to have that serous cavity and it's filled with serous fluid. This is an oily substance. It lubricates. It's made by the cells of the serous membranes, and it helps reduce the friction of the body organs. So the lungs are going to have a serous membrane. We call that the pleura. And so you'll see a visceral pleura closest to the lung. Then you'll see the parietal pleura on the other side that is closest to the body cavity surface. Here we have a really flat cell, so this is epithelium here. So it's a simple squamous cell, and then the underlying connective tissue right there making the body membrane. There's two layers of that, so visceral layer, parietal layer, and then that serous cavity with serous fluid. So should really write in here, this is also going to have serous fluid. An example of the lung up here. So when you're developing, you have a serous membrane shown in blue, and you have this cavity. The lung comes in, and as it fills the cavity, you create the visceral layer and now the parietal layer. And now you have the serous membrane. So in general, we know that we have a parietal layer. We know that we have a visceral layer and then fluid in a cavity in between. We're going to name 3 different serous membranes. One is the pericardium. Then we know we have 3 layers to a serous membrane. So the pericardium will say parietal pericardium, pericardial cavity with pericardial fluid, and visceral pericardium. The last serous membrane that we have is the peritoneum. This is in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Again, the abdominal pelvic cavity subcavities include just the abdominal and then the pelvic. We call this peritoneum, so we have parietal peritoneum, which you kind of see here all around. And then you're going to have visceral peritoneum around many different organs. The derivatives of the skin, which include nails, hair, and glands. It's going to provide protection. Briefly, we'll just say protection of microorganisms. You can actually consider it part of the immune system too. It's the biggest barrier that we have. The skin is the largest organ that we have. It takes like 8% of our body weight. It's going to help protect you from some damage. UV rays can cause DNA damage, so we have protective mechanisms. We have reproduced melanin, the pigment of your skin, to help shield the nuclei of our cells against that radiation. It's really highly involved in regulation of body temperature. We'll learn about the Marroquin sweat glands that are responsible for helping to regulate body temperature, because when we get too hot, we sweat. There's lots of cutaneous receptors so that we can feel things. We're going to begin some synthesis of vitamin D. So I say synthesizes vitamin D. It's actually the first step in the synthesis. We'll look at that in chapter 7 because vitamin D is going to play a major role in bones. And it also prevents water loss. So one of the biggest things that's a threat to life if you have massive third-degree burns on your body is that you'll dehydrate, because the epidermis is providing this waxy barrier that doesn't allow water to easily escape the body. So that keeps our internal organs hydrated. The function of bones in chapter 7. Chapter 8 will be the lab. So we'll study chapter 8 in lab, the actual names of the bones. Skeletal system is involved in support and structure, giving us so we're not just some blob rolling around. Hemopoiesis and hematopoiesis. Hemopoiesis means production of blood cells. Technically, hematopoiesis is the production of white blood cells. You probably add in there erythropoiesis, which is the production of red blood cells, which occurs in the bone marrow. We're going to store lots of calcium and phosphorus for the body. So the actual solidness of the bones is coming from the hydroxyapatite, which is a large salt crystal that stores lots of calcium and phosphorus there. We're also going to be a scaffold for the muscle attachments to facilitate movement along with the muscular system. This slide is just bringing your attention to some of the things that we will see in the future that kind of correlate to the body areas or regions that you're studying with Naked Man. So this might give you some relevance to start making connections to make it easier to remember. The patellar region is the front of the knee, and this is coming from because we have a bone there. The kneecap, the bone there is actually, it's a sesamoid bone, a short bone that is also a sesamoid bone called the patella. The femoral region, that kind of thigh region, that naming convention is coming from the bone that we have there, which is the femur. The tarsal region is the ankle region. We're going to find tarsal bones kind of above. They're part of the foot. So the talus, which is actually part of the tarsal bones, that is involved in the ankle joint. So that's probably where the name is coming from. There's a bone, your heel bone, you can see it in purple here, called the calcaneus. That's going to give you that heel region that on the Naked Man we call calcaneal. It's going to be very, very important that you don't write, if you're talking about the bone, you want to say patella. If you're talking about the region, you want to say patellar. So you want to be careful how you write this so that it is correct. Right side of the slide. So the back of the elbow, the front of the elbow and the back of the elbow are going to have different names. So the back of the elbow is called the olecranal region. That is coming because there is a part of the ulna called the olecranon. So it's just a bone part. We'll learn that when we get to there in lab. So olecranal is the back of the elbow. It's coming because there's a bone part that we call the olecranon, or olecranon process of the ulna. The lumbar region, probably heard of lumbar vertebrae. So that lumbar region of our back, that lower back, is coming from lumbar vertebrae. The sacral region is coming because guess what you find there? We're going to find the bone, the sacrum. So on the lab practical for Naked Man, you'll want to write sacral. If you write sacrum, that's not the body region, that is a bone. So you want to be specific. The hands here, so carpals, we actually call the bones carpals. So carpal is the wrist region. And because that is part of the joint there at the wrist. You might have heard of carpal tunnel before. Maybe you have carpal tunnel. So you should be able to remember carpal quite easily. This little purple region on the lateral side of the hip is called the coxal region. That's because we actually have the coxal joint there. And so we'll learn about that in chapter 9 when we study the joints. Continuing with bones, we have lots of bones. I'm actually going to start on the left side here. So continuing on the left side with the skeletal system, you can see highlighted in this yellow here, we have the nasal bones, because that is your nasal region where your nose is, so your nose is nasal region. The frontal region, we actually have a bone there called the frontal bone. So that's the front of the head. And the back of the head, at least the inferior portion of the back of the head, is called the occipital region, and that correlates to where the occipital bone is. The cervical area, the neck area, comes from, we have cervical vertebrae there, so we'll learn about cervical vertebrae in chapter 7 and 8. Chapter 10 and chapter 11 will kind of more correlate to what the lab is, in naming kind of those muscle groups, kind of how you see on this figure over here. So the actual muscles themselves, the connecting tendons, which will anchor the muscles to that bone structure, and flat tendon-like sheets that we call aponeurosis. There's a large aponeurosis in the abdomen. There's an aponeurosis of the epicranium that we'll study. The major functions of the muscular system are movement, and they also generate heat through the muscle contractions. To move, that takes a lot of energy. We're going to use a lot of ATP, and to create ATP, you need a lot of biochemical reactions. The law of thermodynamics is going to dictate that every time that you transfer energy between one state to another, like you do in biochemical reactions, you're going to lose a little bit by heat. So the muscular system, we're going to generate heat. This is why shivering actually can help increase the body temperature. So when that homeostatic mechanism, if you're getting too cold and you reach the point of shivering, which is often involuntary, that is trying to generate body heat and get you back up to temperature. This picture here is showing you the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a skeletal muscle. It's really neat. It's actually curved. And when it contracts down. So as you're watching this video, when you see it kind of move down, you're contracting and you're actually going to expand your thoracic cavity, which allows for your lungs to inflate. You'll learn about that in the respiratory chapter. You'll see the diaphragm on the models that we have in lab. You won't see the whole thing because we've cut through, right? We've cut through kind of that in a frontal section there. So you're really only seeing the back half of the diaphragm. Sometimes I have a little bit of it on the lungs, the portion of the lungs that are not seen in this picture right here. That you need to know for lab 1, the buccal region, this is the cheek. So the muscle that we have there is called the buccinators. You might have heard of a buccal swab. So if you've ever gotten a DNA test, my twins, we did a zygosity test, and so we got the kit sent to us, and we had to swab their cheeks and send it off, and we took a buccal swab. So that's the cheek area. The deltoid area, that is coming from the muscle that is there, which is the deltoid muscle, which allows you to kind of raise your arms at your side. It's called deltoid because deltoid means triangle, and it's very triangular shaped. On the posterior region of naked man, we have the gluteal region. This is coming, we're going to learn about, there's actually 3 muscles with the gluteus. We have gluteus maximus, which I've shown here. Underneath that, there's a gluteus medius, and then there's actually a gluteus minimus too. Gluteus maximus and medius will be on our muscle list when we get to that in lab. Okay, so the nervous system. This is going to be the last unit that we cover. It's chapter 12 through 16, so it's a large chapter. This is going to include the brain and the spinal cord, which are your central nervous system. We'll study the spinal cord in chapter 14. Brain will be chapter 13. Eyes and ears we'll study in chapter 16. Taste buds is chapter 16. We really only focus on the eyes and ears with that. And we'll look at some of the peripheral nerves. That'll be chapter 14. We're going to control our muscles. So most of the skeletal muscles are under voluntary control, which means that you consciously control them. Some muscles are under involuntary control, and most of the smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, well, cardiac muscle does its own thing. It creates its own contraction, but smooth muscle is very much under involuntary control. Muscles will respond to stimuli, so most skeletal muscles will get a nerve impulse, which will cause contractions, but you're going to sense things by responding to stimuli. The brain is going to have, when we get there, we'll talk about the consciousness, intelligence, memory. Most of that is all going to the frontal lobe of the brain, which we'll learn about. This is covered in 169, but we're doing a survey of the body, so we're including it in Lab 1 and kind of making sure we know where things go. We will kind of talk about the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. We'll talk about the hypothalamus, pituitary gland when we get to the brain. We've already might have talked about it with that homeostasis. So the hypothalamus is involved in homeostasis. There's other types of glands. These are all endocrine glands. In contrast, we're going to also have exocrine glands, which we'll look at in the integument. Endocrine glands dump hormones into the bloodstream. The pineal gland, you'll study that in the brain. The thyroid, the parathyroid, those you might hear about. Some of the hormones that we study in chapter 7 will come from the thyroid and the parathyroid, which will be important for bone function. Thymus, thymus, you can say immune system also, but it does have endocrine function. Pancreas has endocrine function. Kidney has some endocrine function. So these are they produce some particular hormones that are involved in the endocrine system. So endocrine is going to be hormone production and regulate lots of body functions. Your ovaries and testes, okay, you might thinking reproductive. They are reproductive, but they also produce some hormones, and anything that produces hormones can also be co-classified as the endocrine system. So as I mentioned before in that previous slide, we're going to talk about the thyroid and the parathyroid are going to produce some hormones for us that are going to be important for bone growth. The pituitary gland, you see here on this picture of the brain, this is a mid-sagittal section. We will study this picture in lab and lecture. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus that we've been talking about in chapter 1, being that control center, is here. This is the hypothalamus. It is going to be connected by this infundibulum to the pituitary gland. Also part of the endocrine system, the adrenal gland. So the adrenals, the name, sometimes you call it suprarenal. Add, the prefix add is kind of around or to the side, and renal is what we call the kidneys. So adrenal means that they sit on top of the kidneys, and in chapter 15 we'll address this because of the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, and we'll see how the adrenal medulla gives you is a source for epinephrine and norepinephrine. So epinephrine is adrenaline. These are, when they're produced in mass from the adrenal glands, they're considered a hormone, but norepinephrine is going to be a neurotransmitter that we also study. If you haven't caught before, So the words medulla. Medulla means the inner portion, and cortex is going to mean the outer portion. So in the adrenal glands, the cortex, those cells there are going to produce different. They're going to produce the cortisol, and the medulla is going to produce the epinephrine and norepinephrine. But you'll see cortex and medulla a lot throughout 168 and 169. The kidneys, those that renal describes kidneys, and you'll see the adrenals right on top of them. You'll want to look for the ovary in the female model. Pancreas is part of endocrine, so you'll locate these on the models. Cardiovascular system, obviously the heart, blood vessels, which include arteries, veins, and capillaries. Major functions are circulation, delivery of hormones through the bloods, nutrients, and oxygen to tissues. Oxygen is going to be picked up from the lungs. When you learn about the cardiovascular system, you'll learn that you have the returning deoxygenated blood coming in the vena cava. It's going to go through the right side of the heart, and then it'll go to the lungs, and that's where it picks up the oxygen. So we're going to pick up oxygen from the lungs and deliver it to the tissues. So then it goes to the left side of the heart and then out the aorta and all through the tissues. Then you use it, and then you're going to pick up waste, metabolic waste. You're going to pick up carbon dioxide. We'll learn how that is a byproduct of cellular respiration. And then you're going to return it to the lungs. So when the deoxygenated blood returns to the lungs, you're also getting rid of carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen. The lymphatic system, your books kind of put the immune system in here also. So the thymus and the spleen are important. We need to know the spleen for lab. Includes tonsils and lymph nodes, the thoracic duct, and lymph vessels. So you kind of see on this girl over here, all of the green, usually lymph vessels are all in green. You're going to transport and filter lymph. What is lymph? Well, the cardiovascular system, when you're in the tissues, you're at the capillaries, and you're kind of exchanging all of these nutrients and picking up waste, there's the fluid kind of leaks out of your blood into the tissues a little bit. And most of it returns to the veins, but not all of it does. That fluid in the tissue is referred to as lymph, and it'll drain through the lymphatic system. And so all of those lymph vessels will eventually drain into the thoracic duct, and then the thoracic duct is going to drain into the vena cava, so it will return to the cardiovascular system. Things that any part of air kind of goes past, so the nose, the throat, pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and going into the lung tissue. We're going to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. I talked about that a little bit with the cardiovascular system. For the lab, you need to know the lungs. Urinary system. This one's pretty simple. I think there's really only the kidneys. So we have a left and right kidney. The ureters are connecting. They're going to drain from the kidney to the bladder. And how the urine exits the body is through the urethra. Now, this shows a female. It's going to be a little bit different anatomy in the male, so you want to make sure in lab to kind of look at that male and female. We're going to filter the blood to remove the waste. The kidneys are really extraordinary, and you're going to, it's going to be very intense when you get to that in 169, because that system where you're actually doing all of this membrane transport and exchange is just really complex. But you concentrate that waste, you take it out of the blood, and you concentrate it into the urine, and then of course you're going to expel that urine from the body. Speaking of the male and female model, so you'll see the bladder on both. It's going to look different. You'll see that there's a for lab, and I'm going to highlight here, Don't confuse the bladder with the uterus. Okay, I'm going to put a big U for uterus. The bladder is underneath the uterus. If you're a woman who's been pregnant, you know this. The bladder in the male, kind of underneath the male bladder, the other thing that you need to know for lab, and I'm going to circle it and write a P, that's the prostate gland. Kidneys, on the torso model, the bladder is in that hypogastric region. Oral cavity and the throat, the pharynx. And you're going to have the esophagus. And then you're going to go into the stomach. And the liver is an accessory organ. But then the stomach kind of empties into the small intestine. Then the small intestine will empty into the large intestine. That's kind of what this little video down here is showing. There's a process called peristalsis. So peristalsis, actually, you have peristalsis in your esophagus and you have it in the intestines, but that's kind of going to move the bolus of food and move the contents through your digestive system. What you're seeing in this little video clip that's playing here is you'll start to see it, peristalsis moving up the ascending colon, and then you see it move across the transverse colon, and you can see that it's actually forming the bowel movement there. So it'll move across, and then it'll move down the descending colon, and then to the sigmoid colon, and to the rectum, and then out the anus. Major functions, of course, food digestion, nutrient absorption, and then waste excretion. This slide just shows kind of where you're going to find it in lab. This is exactly from lab material. So you see the liver, it's going to take up a large portion of that abdominal region. The gallbladder is green. It's going to secrete bile, and you're really only seeing the tip of it. When you look over on the right side, I've kind of taken the liver out, and you'll see that it extends a little bit more, but it is on the underside of the liver. I just talked through the ascending, transverse, and descending colon in the small intestine. So the large intestine is made up of ascending, transverse, and descending colon. The esophagus, you'll only see on the model if you remove the heart. So it is behind there. Most of the esophagus is in that mediastinum, which is inside the thoracic cavity. A little bit of the esophagus is going to punch down to where it actually connects to the stomach in the abdominal pelvic cavity in that epigastric region. The pancreas, you won't see on the model when it's put together. You have to remove the stomach, and then you'll kind of see it tucked in there behind the large intestine. The appendix is on the back side of the model. You won't find it on the big model that we have in lab, but you'll find it on the two small models. And it is that little region right where the small intestine is going to dump into the large intestine. Don't confuse the uterus with the bladder. So I've talked about this with on the previous slide. So I've labeled the bladder here. You need to know where the ovaries are and where the uterus is. The last thing that we kind of talk about in lab that you need to know, we really won't talk about this in lecture very much. I don't really put it on my lecture exams, are these abdominal pelvic regions. So these only apply if you were in the abdominal pelvic cavity. There's 9 regions. In the middle, we have umbilical. So you've probably heard of your umbilical cord that connects the baby to the placenta. So that's the umbilical region. We're in the stomach, so we're using gastric as a root word. Epi is a prefix that means above, so the epigastric region is in that central region, the most superior of the 9 abdominopelvic regions, central superior. Hypo is meaning below, hypogastric is below. Then the hypochondriac, lumbar, and iliac, those are on the lateral sides, and then you just use left and right for anatomical left and right. Right hypochondriac, right lumbar, right iliac, left hypochondriac, left lumbar, left iliac. You'll want to put all of the organs that we learn for lab. I might ask you what region they go to. In lab, I might ask you, after you name an organ, what quadrant is it in? So if I asked about the liver, you'd want to say it's right upper and left upper.